Hash the best and worst wedding favors I've ever seen. Story 1. My name is Daniel, and the bride in this story, Priya, is my younger sister. I still remember standing at the edge of the dance floor at 10 o'clock at night, sweating through my shirt, watching people who had been dancing non-stop since the toast at 6. Priya and her husband Marcus had planned a long reception. Dinner, speeches, first dance, and then hours of open bar and a DJ who refused to let anyone sit down. By the time the night wore on, I noticed something strange happening near the exit doors. There was a table set up that hadn't been there earlier, and on it sat stacks of white paper bags with golden arches printed on the side, along with a metal tub full of ice and glass bottles of Coca-Cola. At first I thought a caterer had made a mistake and delivered the wrong order, but then I watched my sister's new mother-in-law walk over, grinning, and start handing out burgers to guests as they stumbled off the dance floor. It turned out Priya and Marcus had quietly arranged the whole thing weeks in advance. A midnight snack station they never announced, because they wanted it to be a surprise. Nobody had eaten a proper meal in hours. The wine and the dancing had burned through whatever calories the wedding dinner provided, and suddenly, here was hot, salty, greasy food being handed out like it was the most elegant thing in the world. I watched grown adults in tuxedos and evening gowns tear into cheeseburgers like they hadn't eaten in a week. My uncle, who had been complaining all night about his feet, sat down right on the curb outside with a burger in one hand and a glass bottle of Coke in the other, looking more content than he had all evening. Even the band members, packing up their instruments, grabbed a couple of bags on their way out. I overheard one of Priya's coworkers say it was the best decision she'd seen at any wedding, better than any fancy dessert bar or champagne tower. What struck me most was how simple the idea was. Weddings can get so complicated. Florists, seating charts, custom calligraphy on place cards, that people forget the most basic thing a host can do for tired, hungry guests is feed them something comforting. My sister didn't need a 5-tier cake with edible gold leaf to impress anyone that night. She needed grease, salt, and cold soda at the exact moment everyone needed it most, and she nailed the timing perfectly. Looking back, I think that's the mark of thoughtful hosting. Knowing your guests well enough to predict what they'll actually want, not just what looks good in photos. A midnight snack run is not glamorous. It won't end up in the wedding album on its own merit. But ask anyone who was there that night what they remember most fondly, and I'd bet good money more than half of them mention the burgers before they mention the vows. It taught me that sometimes the most memorable gesture at a big, expensive event is also the cheapest and most practical one, because it shows the host was actually paying attention to how their guests felt in real time, not just how the event looked on paper. I still tease Priya about it sometimes, telling her she should franchise the idea. She just laughs and says she'd do it again in a heartbeat. Sometimes the best wedding gift isn't a gift at all. It's just someone remembering that at the end of a long night, everyone just wants to feel a little bit taken care of. Next, though, I want to tell you about a wedding where the sentimental gesture wasn't about food at all, but about a stack of quiet, handwritten memories waiting at every single seat. Story 2. I'm Hannah, and I was invited to the wedding of my college roommate, Ines, when she married her partner, Sophia, last spring. I'd known Ines for almost 8 years by that point, through late-night study sessions, breakups, career changes, and eventually watching her fall in love with someone who made her genuinely happy for the first time in years. So when I got the invitation, I already knew it would mean something to me. What I didn't expect was how much thought had gone into the smallest detail on the reception tables. When I found my seat, there was a small card sitting on top of my napkin. At first glance, it looked like a simple wedding favor, maybe a thank you note printed in bulk the way most couples do. But when I picked it up, I realized it was an actual photograph. A real photo of me and Ines together, taken years earlier during a spring break trip we'd gone on in our 20s. I hadn't seen that picture in years. I didn't even remember someone taking it. On the back, in Ines' own handwriting, was a short note reminding me of the night the photo was taken, referencing an inside joke between us that I hadn't thought about in ages, and thanking me for being there for her through everything since. I looked around the table and realized every single guest had something similar. A different photo, a different memory, a different handwritten note, each one specific to that person's relationship with Ines and Sophia. My cousin, who barely knew the couple and had only met them a handful of times, got a photo from the one dinner they'd all had together 2 years earlier, with a note thanking him for driving 4 hours to be there. Nobody at that table had the same card. It wasn't a template. It was clearly the product of the couple sitting down together, going through years of photos and writing dozens of individual messages by hand. I later found out from Sophia that it had taken her and Ines nearly 3 months to put it all together, working on it a little at a time after work most evenings. They dug through old phones, social media archives, and even asked a few mutual friends to send pictures they didn't have. It wasn't cheap either, since printing that many custom photo cards adds up, but the cost wasn't really the point. The point was that every guest walked away feeling individually seen and remembered, rather than like one face in a crowd of 150 people. Most wedding favors get left behind on the table or tossed in a junk drawer within a month. Mine is still on my refrigerator. I've moved apartments twice since that wedding, and it has come with me both times, tucked carefully between recipe magnets and grocery lists. That's the real difference, I think. A generic favor is meant to be seen once and forgotten, while a personal one is meant to be kept and revisited. What I took away from that night is that the most meaningful gestures aren't always the most expensive ones. They're the ones that require the giver to actually think about the receiver as an individual person with a shared history, rather than as a name on a guest list. It's a lesson I've tried to carry into my own life since, even in small ways, like remembering specific details when I write birthday cards now instead of defaulting to generic phrases. But not every thoughtful gesture at a wedding is quiet and sentimental. The next story I want to tell you about is a lot more practical, and it saved an entire dance floor full of women from sore, blistered feet. Story 3. My name is Grace, and the bride in question, Meredith, is my best friend since middle school. I was one of her bridesmaids, which meant I had a front row seat to just how much thought she and her husband Owen put into every part of their wedding day. Most of the planning conversations I remember were about flowers, seating charts, and whether the DJ should take requests. What I did not expect was a conversation, about 2 months before the wedding, where Meredith asked me seriously, "What size shoe do you wear, just in case?" I didn't think much of it at the time. It wasn't until the reception itself that I understood what she'd been planning. Right at the edge of the dance floor, tucked discreetly near the DJ booth, sat a large woven basket overflowing with flip-flops in every size imaginable, from small enough for a preteen cousin to large enough for Meredith's 6-foot-tall aunt. By 9 o'clock, half the women at the wedding, myself included, had kicked off their heels and traded them in for a comfortable pair of sandals so we could actually dance without wincing every time we landed wrong on the hardwood floor. It didn't stop there, either. Earlier in the evening, every guest had received a small welcome bag at their hotel room, and inside was a mix of things clearly chosen by someone who had actually thought through what a full day of celebrating in the summer heat would involve. There was a small bottle of sunscreen for the outdoor ceremony, a folding paper fan for anyone who got warm sitting in the sun, a bottle of electrolyte powder to mix into water, and a small packet of pain relievers that, judging by the little handwritten label taped to it, were clearly meant to double as a hangover remedy the next morning. I remember laughing about it with the other bridesmaids at the time, joking that Meredith had basically packed us an emergency survival kit disguised as party favors. But by 11 that night, watching Meredith's grandmother happily two-stepping in a bright pink pair of flip-flops that clashed spectacularly with her formal dress, I understood the genius of it. Nobody cared that it didn't match. Everyone was too busy actually having fun, unencumbered by blisters or dehydration or the beginnings of a headache from one too many glasses of champagne. The next morning, several of us compared notes over breakfast, and more than one person admitted the electrolyte packet from the welcome bag had genuinely helped them function well enough to make the send-off brunch on time. It's such a small, unglamorous thing to think about when planning what is supposed to be the most romantic day of your life, but it made an enormous difference to everyone who attended. What I've come to appreciate about that wedding, looking back, is that Meredith and Owen thought about their guests' physical comfort with the same seriousness most couples reserve for aesthetics. It's easy to spend a fortune on flowers and lighting and completely forget that you're asking a room full of adults to stand, dance, and drink for 6 or 7 hours straight. The couples who plan for that reality, rather than just the photographs, tend to throw the weddings people actually remember fondly rather than just admire from a polite distance. Not every clever idea at a wedding has to be sentimental to be memorable. Sometimes it's genuinely useful. And speaking of useful ideas that guests actually get to keep using, the next story is about a wedding favor that never even made it home in its original form, because it was eaten and drunk before anyone left the building. Story 4. I'm Teresa, and I've known the groom, Adam, since he was a kid, back when I used to babysit him and his younger sister every summer growing up. So when he got married to his college sweetheart, Layla, in Maryland a few years ago, I was thrilled to be invited, even though by then Adam was well into his 30s and I hadn't seen him in person in a while. What struck me almost immediately, walking into the reception hall, was a small station set up near the bar, decorated simply but clearly with intention, with little glass jars lined up in neat rows. Each jar had a handwritten label that read Old BAE, a playful pun on Old Bay seasoning, which anyone from that part of Maryland will recognize instantly as a beloved regional spice blend used on crab, fries, and honestly, almost anything savory. Underneath the pun, in smaller print, was a note explaining that the seasoning inside had been custom mixed in honor of Adam and Layla's wedding, along with their names and the date. I picked one up expecting it to be some kind of decorative prop, the type of thing that looks nice on a table but that nobody actually uses, and instead found out it was real, usable Old Bay seasoning, generously portioned, clearly meant to be taken home and put to use in an actual kitchen. By the end of the night, I noticed the display was completely empty. Not a single jar remained on the table, and I later heard from Layla's mother that they'd ordered what she thought was an excessive amount, worried they'd be stuck with boxes of leftover seasoning jars sitting in someone's garage for years. Instead, guests were taking 2 and 3 jars each, some clearly planning to give extras to family members who couldn't attend the wedding. It reminded me of another wedding I'd been to a couple of years earlier, thrown by a young couple who had partnered with a small local coffee roaster to create a custom blend named after their soon-to-be-shared last name. That coffee was served fresh at the reception itself, brewed and poured throughout the cocktail hour, and small bags of the same beans were sent home with every guest as a favor. I still had half a bag of that coffee sitting in my pantry a full year later, and every time I made a pot of it, it brought me right back to standing in that reception hall, watching the couple's first dance. What both of these weddings taught me, watching them a few years apart, is that consumable favors solve a problem almost every other kind of favor creates. A magnet, a keychain, a tiny picture frame. These things are sweet in the moment, but almost always end up forgotten in a junk drawer within a few weeks, more out of guilt than genuine attachment. Food and drink don't have that problem. They get used, they get enjoyed, and then they're simply gone, leaving behind only a pleasant memory rather than clutter. I've started recommending this idea to every engaged friend who asks me for favor ideas now. It doesn't have to be expensive or elaborate. Even something as simple as a small jar of local honey or a bag of good tea leaves does the trick. The goal isn't extravagance. It's practicality dressed up with a little sentiment, which in my experience beats sentimentality alone almost every time. Not every favor a couple gives their guests is meant to be eaten right away, though. Some are meant to grow, quite literally, over many years. Which brings me to a very different kind of gift, one that a friend of mine still has proof of a full decade later. Story 5. My name is Marisol, and I was a guest at the wedding of my close friend from graduate school, Willa, who married her husband Theo almost exactly 10 years ago now. I still think about that wedding more often than most others I've attended since, mostly because of a tiny detail that has quietly followed me around ever since. A small ceramic teacup, no bigger than my palm, sitting on my kitchen windowsill even today. Willa and Theo had built their entire wedding around a soft botanical theme, with greenery draped across every surface and dried flowers pressed into the invitations they'd mailed out months earlier. When I sat down for the reception dinner, I found a small vintage-style teacup and saucer at my place setting, the kind you might find at an antique shop, mismatched slightly from the ones at neighboring tables in a way that felt deliberate rather than sloppy. Inside each teacup was a small, healthy succulent, its roots tucked into a thin layer of soil and pebbles. At the time, I assumed it was just a decorative centerpiece, doubling as a favor. Cute for the evening, but probably destined to die within a month once I inevitably forgot to water it, the way most plant-based gifts do in my experience. I actually said as much to the friends sitting next to me at dinner, half joking that I was terrible with anything that needed sunlight and consistency. But something about the little teacup made me want to try harder than usual. Maybe it was the effort so obviously put into finding dozens of mismatched teacups in the first place. Or maybe it was simply guilt at the idea of letting something so clearly cared for wither on my windowsill. Whatever the reason, I kept it alive. Within a year, it had outgrown the little teacup, and I moved it into a slightly larger pot. A few years after that, I split it into 2 separate plants when it started crowding itself, giving one half to my sister as a housewarming gift when she bought her first apartment. The original teacup itself still sits on my windowsill today, empty of soil now, repurposed to hold loose change and spare buttons, but never thrown away. A few months ago, I ran into Willa at a mutual friend's baby shower, and I showed her a photo of the plant, now a full, healthy specimen taking up an entire corner of my kitchen counter. She told me she still gets photos like that from other guests fairly regularly, even a decade later, people sending updates unprompted just because they're proud of how well they've kept the plant alive. Apparently, more than a few of those original succulents have been split, repotted, and passed along to new generations of plant owners entirely unrelated to the wedding itself. What I find remarkable about that gift, looking back, is that it's the rare wedding favor that actually grows more meaningful with time instead of less. A printed napkin or a personalized koozie is at its most exciting the day you receive it, and only fades in relevance afterward. A living plant does the opposite. It becomes a slow, quiet reminder every single day, for years, long after most people have forgotten who else attended that wedding or what the flowers looked like. Of course, not every attempt at a living wedding favor turns out so well. In fact, the last story I want to tell you is something of a cautionary tale, involving a different kind of living creature entirely, one that should never have been handed out as a party prize in the first place. Story 6. I'm Patrick, and the bride, Nicole, was a coworker of mine before she left our company to take a job across the country a few years back. We'd stayed loosely in touch, so when she invited a handful of former colleagues to her wedding, I was happy to attend, even though I didn't know many other guests there personally. I remember walking into the reception hall and immediately noticing something unusual sitting in the center of my assigned table. A small, round glass bowl filled with water, and inside it, swimming in slow, nervous circles, was a single goldfish. At first I assumed it was simply an eccentric centerpiece, maybe a nod to some inside joke between Nicole and her new husband that I wasn't aware of. It wasn't until partway through dinner that one of the event coordinators explained the actual plan over the microphone. Each table would play a short trivia game about the couple, and whichever guest at each table answered the most questions correctly would win the goldfish sitting at their table's center, to take home that very night. I want to be clear that I did not want to win a goldfish. Nobody at my table particularly wanted to win a goldfish, as far as I could tell from the nervous laughter that rippled around when the rules were explained. And yet, purely by chance, I ended up correctly guessing the year Nicole and her husband first met, and just like that, I was informed I had won the round and would be taking a live animal home with me that night, in a plastic bag someone hastily produced from behind the gift table, with absolutely no food, no tank, and no instructions of any kind. I spent the rest of the reception with a bag of water and a very confused-looking fish sitting under my chair, trying to figure out logistics in my head instead of actually enjoying the open bar. I had a 90-minute drive home ahead of me that night, and I remember genuinely worrying the entire way whether the fish would survive the trip sloshing around on the passenger seat. When I got home well past midnight, I had to make an emergency run to a 24-hour store just to buy a bowl, some dechlorinated water conditioner, and fish food, none of which I had ever needed or wanted to own. The fish, which I ended up naming Nico after the bride out of sheer resigned humor, lived for about 3 weeks before it passed away, which, from what I later read online, is fairly typical for goldfish handed out this way, since the stress of transport and improper acclimation kills most of them within the first month, regardless of how carefully the new owner tries afterward. I never told Nicole any of this, mostly because I didn't want to make her feel bad about what she clearly thought was a fun, quirky idea at the time. Looking back, I think the entire concept fundamentally misunderstands what a party favor is supposed to be. A favor should never come with a genuine, unwanted obligation attached to it, and it should certainly never depend on the guest having the resources, time, or willingness to keep another living creature alive with zero warning. Live animals are not novelties, and using one as a prize turns what should be a joyful wedding memory into a stressful, guilt-laden responsibility for whoever happens to win. If there's one lesson from that entire evening, it's a simple one. No matter how cute or memorable the idea sounds in the planning stages, living creatures should never, under any circumstances, double as a wedding party favor.